Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heaven Worth Thinking. Today we're continuing on in the book of Exodus. We're in Exodus chapter 14 and we'll be going through verse 14 today. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." This section has a lot of little parts important for us to not just skip over and look at that end section. It's very tempting just to go straight to that end section, but we have a lot of parts in this section that speak about God's plan here with the Israelites and that are very applicable for us in our daily lives. First, we see that the Lord gives further instructions to Moses. He tells him to have the Israelites turn back and encamp in a certain area so that Pharaoh is going to think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And then God says he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart again, and that Pharaoh is going to pursue them. However, he explains here the whole point of this section. "I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." Again, the whole point of the plagues was not just to get the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, though that was certainly what God was doing. The point was to have the Lord be glorified, the Lord be exalted, the Lord be shown to be who he is, mighty, powerful, the only God. So we see that here continuing on in this section. We see that the Lord is giving the Israelites specific instructions. Last week we talked about how he had them go not on the shortest route, but had them go on a longer way through the desert because he knew that the Philistine country was where they would have gone through if they had gone through the shortest area, and that they might turn back if they were faced with war. And so we saw that God's plan and his timing, his directions are not always what ours are. In fact, they almost always are different. But God's ways are better because he knows what lies ahead of us. He knows what needs to happen. However, that doesn't mean that everything is going to be easy and super seamless. We see here in this section that it's going to be challenging. God directly has his people do something to put them in a difficult situation, not to put them in an easy situation. He could have easily had them just keep on going, but instead he has them camp in a certain area so that Pharaoh will come after them, so that they're going to have to go through a hard time. And that's the same God we serve today is the same God in this section. He's going to put us in places. He's going to put us in circumstances and situations. He's going to allow us to go through things that are very difficult, that put us on trial, that put us in the hot seat where we have to trust in God because he has a plan and he wants to use us in that plan. Last week we talked about God wanting to be, he is a relational God wanting to use us, and that we need to be open to that. That's the same thing in this section. He's using the people of Israel to bring glory to his name, to serve a greater purpose. And that's what we see here in this section. Then we see the fulfillment of that. So God warns them, hey, he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and we see that. We see that when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, he and his officials changed their minds. Man, they are great at this. We have seen this time and time again. Pharaoh, he gets it for 1 second. He's like, yep, please stop the plague, and immediately I'll let you go. And then as soon as the plague stops, he says, nope, just kidding. Let's make your work harder. Like, we've seen this guy has a very hard time sticking with yes or no. Like, he's just constantly changing his mind. And we've seen that God is working in him. This isn't just him working, him hardening his own heart. This is the Lord using him. Because again, what's the point of this section? The point is for the Lord to bring glory to his name, that he is going to show all of the Egyptians that he is the Lord. So he uses this wicked king. He uses this wicked Pharaoh so that he can glorify his name, that his name can be magnified on a grand nationwide and worldwide stage. And he's going to do the same thing in our daily lives. He wants to get the glory on a worldwide stage. He wants us all to point to him. And so he'll use difficult situations. He'll use crazy people like Pharaoh. He'll use situations that we think he could never use or would never use, and he'll use them all for his glory. Certainly that's what we see here. So we see that Pharaoh, he's very, very serious. He takes 600 of the best chariots, and then just on top of that, he takes all the other chariots, and he takes all of these horsemen, troops. He pursues the Israelites. Man, you'd think he is going to try to conquer the world here. World superpower, taking all of his army and going after slaves. Like, we see the craziness, and that when you have a hardened heart, and when a person has a hardened heart and they're not responsive to God, we can see the absolute insanity of their decisions. And we look at this and we go, that is crazy, that's insane. Why would you take your entire army and go pursue a group of slaves that because you had them as slaves, the God of the world brought all these plagues upon you and devastated your land? Why would you want to take all your army out to chase after them and bring those people back? There's so many things that just don't add up and don't make sense in that. Yet we look at that and we think that's crazy. And in our own lives, when we do crazy things and we harden our hearts against God, when we're not responsive to his prompting, to his Holy Spirit, when we're not responsive to God, we think it's not crazy, the things we do. And yet other people look at our lives and they realize something's off, something's crazy. Why are you acting that way? We act that way because we harden our hearts against God. We don't listen to what he says. And when we don't listen to what God says, we do crazy things. And things that ultimately, we know how this story ends up. This doesn't end up well for the Egyptians. This entire army is going to be devastated and destroyed. So this guy and his officials, their hardness, their pride, their control, their want for control, devastates an entire nation, entire army here. So we need to be careful that we're not hardening our hearts, that we're listening to God. We see here also the flip side of this. We see the Egyptian side. Now we're going to look at the Israelite side. The Israelites, they see the Egyptians marching after them. Now you would think they have this pillar of cloud, this pillar of fire that they've been following. They've seen 10 plagues. They've seen amazing signs. They've seen God do all these amazing things. You think they're going to say, this is the moment. God is going to win this battle for us. We have nothing to fear. He's clearly made a way every other single time where there was no way. He's going to make a way again. No, they don't do that. And we don't do that either. We actually are like the Israelites every day. We do the same thing here. They say to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done by bringing us out to Egypt? Didn't we say, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Now this is drama queen ever, like written all over it is the word drama queen. But yet we do the same thing in our daily lives. We look at a situation, whether it be the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, struggles with economics, whatever it is, we look at the situation and we go, God, see, I told you I should just do this myself. If you would have just left me alone, if I hadn't done whatever you told me to do, it would have been better for me to do this. I should just be in slavery, and now I'm going to die. I mean, we might not say those exact words, but we certainly say things like that. We certainly complain to God and to godly leaders, whether it be a pastor or some kind of spiritual leader in our lives. We constantly are complaining and grumbling against God and against his leaders because we are afraid ultimately, and that's what the Israelites here are. They're afraid. They're doubting God. They're doubting Moses. They're doubting everything that they shouldn't be doubting. They have a reason for confidence. They've seen God work. They've seen that Moses is fulfilling what God tells him to do. He's doing what God tells him to do, so he's walking according to God. So they know they can trust Moses and God, and they've seen the amazing things God has done time and time again, and yet they refuse to get it in this section. They let their fear overcome their rationality. And so we see what a hardening of our hearts does with Pharaoh. It makes us do irrational things. We just talked about that. But also fear makes us be irrational. And so when we are afraid, when the enemy comes against us and puts something in our path, something that we can't conquer on our own, we often react in fear, which then leads to irrational actions. like this, where we complain, and instead of trusting in God or turning to God, we turn to anger, frustration, complaining, whatever it is, and we see that in this section. So we should, instead of just looking at this and going, wow, the Israelites are just, they don't ever get it, we should look at them with compassion, because we're really looking in the mirror at ourselves. We're really looking at what we do daily. But we see here another flip side. So we've seen the Egyptians, we've seen what not to do. We now looked at the Israelites, we've seen what not to do. And we're going to look now finally at Moses and see what to do actually in this section. And again, Moses is not a perfect human being. He did not do everything perfectly. We know that if you've looked ahead. In future chapters, you know that Moses was not perfect, yet we've seen time and time again he has been an example for us to follow, to model our own lives after. We need to be more like Moses, who trusts in God. He has seen God do amazing things, and so he is continuing to trust in God. He looks at the situation and answers the people very, very differently than the way they answered in this section. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you will see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. This is quite amazing to see his response. We've seen him be hesitant, and we've seen him be resistant. We saw that with the burning bush, how he really resisted God's call to him. He didn't want to lead the people. He kept coming up with excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse, just like we do. But here he's learned something. We've seen some spiritual growth in his life. God has been working not only in and through him, but in his life personally. He has been building him up and strengthening his faith. And so we see here a very different Moses than we saw several chapters back with the burning bush. We've seen Moses go from someone who is afraid, someone who doesn't have confidence to do what God has called him to do, to someone now who is believing that the Lord's going to fight for him and for the Israelites, that they just need to be still and wait upon the Lord. Again, that not only shows us his faith, but also shows us a little glimpse of who God is. God is the one who fights for us. We cannot accomplish great things in our lives on our own. We just can't. Anything we do try to accomplish on our own, we know even our own righteousness, Scripture says, is filthy rags. Nothing we do in our lives can ultimately be amazing if we don't let God work in us, if we don't trust in God, if we don't have his help. And so we see that it's not the Israelites are just going to be saved by something they do. Moses doesn't promise that. He promises that the Lord's going to fight for them. So my challenge ultimately for you this week is to trust in the Lord. Let the Lord fight for you. You just need to trust in him this week. Look to his deliverance, not the deliverance of yourself, not the deliverance of anything in this world. Trust in the Lord. Follow after him. Make sure your heart is not hard. Make sure it's not afraid, but confident in who God is and what he is going to do as he fights for you while you remain still. As always, join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.